안녕하세요. This is going to be a rant video and we are going to discuss one of the most controversial manhwas of all time, Jinx. Now, before you guys who have read the manhwa pounce on me, my opinion on Jinx is going to be even more controversial because I think Jinx is kinda decent and even good at times. And before you guys think that I am a psychopath, please hear me out, okay? Do I think the protagonist of the story, Joo Jae-kyung, is an inhumane piece of scum who deserves to rot in hell or at the very least go to jail? Of course. Do I think that Kim Dan, the second protagonist, is very deserving of therapy and the story needs to focus more on his mental health and the repercussions of the suffering he goes through? Totally. Do I think that Joo Jae-kyung and Kim Dan have the most toxic relationship in all of anime or manhwa or even media in general? Absolutely. So, why do I say that Jinx is pretty good? It's because Jinx has a very slow but sensible character writing, at least for Kim Dan. And there are other characters in Jinx who are pretty likable, at least according to me. So, for that, please stick around to hear my opinions on Jinx. But if you guys cannot handle topics such as yaoi or unconsensual intercourse or abuse in general, then please exit the video. This is not for you. And if you guys are under 18, then this video is definitely not for you. Like, तुम लोगों के papers आ रहे हैं, क्या कर रहे हो इधर? जाओ जाके पढ़ाई कर लो. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of Jinx. So the ugliest part of Jinx starts off in the first chapter where we meet our physiotherapist Kim Dan, who is just working 5 jobs a day and is struggling to make ends meet because he needs to pay for his grandmother's medical bills and he also needs to deal with his abusive loan sharks, and he is broke as hell because the story really hits him. So enter our second protagonist, Joo Jae-kyung, who is Korea's top MMA fighter, and he is the strongest man in the world, and he is, like all athletes, very arrogant. So Kim Dan gets a call from Joo Jae-kyung to give physiotherapy. And obviously he does that, and Joo Jae-kyung kinda is into it. So he calls Kim Dan again, and Kim Dan is just like, okay, I didn't know you liked it so much, especially after I touched your wiener, and that was by total accident, but who calls me in the middle of the night at 1 a.m.? And Jo Jae-kyung is just like, listen, I'm paying you $5,000 for it. Now, Kim Dan really needs the money, so he goes over to Jo Jae-kyung's house and finds out that Jo Jae-kyung has this very weird jinx, aka a superstition, which is the reason this entire story starts, and it is the reason the entire story functions on. So the superstition or jinx that Joo Jae-kyung has is that he needs to have an intercourse with someone the night before the match, and it needs to be a satisfying one so that he can concentrate on the match the next day and win. Now, guys, if you have this sort of logicless or stupid superstition that can harm others, then please seek help. Do not be like Joo Jae-kyung, okay? But since we are rolling with the story here, Jo Jae-kyung kinda invites Kim Dan and does unconsensual intercourse with him, and we see our poor Kim Dan actually suffering. There are like tears in his eyes, and he is getting PTSD as Jo Jae-kyung asks him, hey, you're really good at this. How many guys have you ever been with before? And what do you know, guys? Since the author really despises Kim Dan, he has been assaulted before at his previous hospital by the physiotherapist and his seniors. So it cost him his job and is the reason he is kind of broke as hell. So Kim Dan is just like, okay, you know what, I am never going to get in touch with Jo Jae-kyung again. But Jo Jae-kyung calls him many times, and Kim Dan is just like, no. And this time it goes to a higher degree when the loan sharks actually find Kim Dan and kind of assault him. And Kim Dan is just like, okay, I got no choice. So he goes to Jo Jae Kyung's house and he is just like, listen, I need 14 grand to pay for my grandmom's medical bills, which have already gotten more expensive because my grandmom is taking a new treatment, and I need to pay off the debt I owe to my abusive loan sharks. So Jo Jae Kyung is just like, okay, but in return, you need to spread your legs for me whenever and wherever. And Kim Dan reluctantly agrees. Now, the ugliest part of Jinx is that in every alternate panel, you will at least find a very disturbing intercourse scene, and each one gets more torturous, more worse than the other. And just to give you an example of how toxic the relationship between Kim Dan and Jo Jae Kyung is, that even if Kim Dan so as to talks to anybody, Jo Jae Kyung just drags him to the side and does unconsensual intercourse with him while poor Kim Dan is just suffering. And then to get an insight on how abusive Jo Jae Kyung is, Jo Jae Kyung actually walks all over Kim Dan's feelings when Kim Dan, almost at the end of the story, kind of works for months to gather enough money to buy Jo Jae Kyung a birthday present. But when he finally says, here, I got you a birthday present, Jo Jae Kyung just slams it to the wall and is just like, bro, you are a tool for me and nothing more. So do not waste your time on nonsense stuff like this, and just do your job that is satisfying my Jinx. So obviously Kim Dan is heartbroken here. Okay. And then the most inhumane scene of Jinx ever is that Kim Dan and Jo Jae Kyung are having an unconsensual intercourse where Kim Dan is obviously enjoying it, and Jo Jae Kyung gets a call from the hospital regarding his grandmom, you know, the only source of joy in his life and the only person whom he is doing this for. So Jo Jae Kyung is just like, listen, I need to take this. And Kim Dan, being the abusive asshole he is, says, no, we are in the middle of the intercourse. You cannot do this to me. And he is just like, listen, my grandmom is more important than anything. So, you know, human life has a regard. And Jo Jae Kyung is just like, oh, no, still, you cannot lift the call. And Kim Dan just kind of lifts the call anyway and then sort of tries to walk away. So then Jo Jae Kyung kind of realizes that, hey, what is this that Kim Dan keeps whining about? And the next bad part of Jinx is Kim Dan's delusional nature. Now, Kim Dan is kind of very delusional in more than half of the chapters of Jinx, because he is just like seeing Jo Jae Kyung cooking these meals for him. And the only reason Jo Jae Kyung did that is because Kim Dan suffers from malnutrition. And with malnutrition comes exhaustion. And with exhaustion, you cannot do anything, which means you cannot tolerate Jo Jae Kyung in his peak form. Because keep in mind, guys, Jo Jae Kyung's wiener is not a wiener. It is his large intestine falling out. Okay, the manhwa at least paints it to be 20 centimeters long. So to get that thing in you needs stamina and requires a lot of endurance to pain. So Jo Jae Kyung obviously is just like, fine, I need to feed this guy nutritional food solely for my needs. And then we see Jo Jae Kyung clearing Kim Dan's hospital debt and clearing his loan shark's abusive debt, because his loan sharks try to abuse him sexually, and so Jo Jae Kyung fights off Kim Dan's loan sharks and is just like, okay, listen, I paid off the debt to you guys. Now, Kim Dan thinks that this is done out of affection and Jo Jae Kyung is actually being nice to him. Kim Dan, honey, no, this is narcissistic behavior 101, okay? Because Kim Dan wants you all to himself and he doesn't want you to have a life outside of him, aka you are committed to Jo Jae Kyung no matter what. And Jo Jae Kyung admits this to Kim Dan in the second last chapter of the manhwa. So this is even more heartbreaking for Kim Dan. Now, we enter into the worst and best parts of Jinx, which is this character Chua Hee Song. Now, Chua Hee Song is an angel of a man, at least when we are going to the standards of Jinx, right? Because Chua Hee Song is a refreshing change from all these disturbing panels we have seen. And Chua Hee Song is an actor who belongs to the same talent agency as Joo Jae Kyung. And since the doctor suggested that, hey, Joo Jae Kyung needs a holiday because he is putting his body through a lot of stress, so Joo Jae Kyung is just like, okay, I will train this actor personally for his action scenes. And Chua Hee Song is just like, wow, okay, even though these two have this kind of frenemy relationship going on. So Jo Jae Kyung is just like, Chua Hee Song, you are such a scumbag. Like, who falls in love at the first sight and then dates them for 2 days and then leaves them? And Chua Hee Song is just like, bro, what are you talking about? Your Jinx is even more ridiculous. And then these two start training, but Chua Hee Song kind of injures his wrist a little in the process, and Kim Dan is just like, oh, let me look at that for you. And what do you know, guys? Chua Hee Song falls in love with Kim Dan. It is love at first sight, and he love bombs Kim Dan by sending him expensive branded stuff and by taking him to this branded coffee shop and everything. And Kim Dan is just not into it. He's just like, why is he doing this and everything? So later, Chua Hee Song accidentally breaks his back, which is very, very intentional because he wants Kim Dan more and more. And so Joo Jae Kyung is just like getting jealous over here, but he can't actually harm an actor. So he is just like, okay, Kim Dan, you can actually, leave. But he does something very, very inhumane to Kim Dan, which I cannot even explain in these panels, okay? So then Kim Dan kind of is with Chua Hee Song giving therapy to his back and everything. And then Joo Jae Kyung is just like, okay, this is getting out of hand. So to prove to Chua Hee Song that, hey, I have my eyes on Kim Dan and do not even go near him, is that he invites Chua Hee Song to his house, and Chua Hee Song witnesses a very disturbing sight, okay? Now, guys, imagine this, okay? You have your eyes on a very pretty girl, and another guy who is easily bigger and more muscular than you is eyeing the same girl, and he is kind of jealous that this girl actually talks to you and smiles at you and everything. So to prove to you that, hey, this girl is mine, what does he do? He calls you to his house. So you enter his house, but you find the girl sitting on his lap without clothes, and she has a gag in her mouth. She has headphones. She is blindfolded. She doesn't even know that you're here. And this guy just looks at you, smiling, and is just like, now do you understand what kind of relationship we have? And you are just so traumatized by this scene, right? So that's exactly what Chua Hee Song witnesses. And he is just like, listen, Kim Dan, you're just too good for Joo Jae Kyung. Like, why do you have this relationship with him? And he is just like, okay, fine. You know what? I will stay away from Kim Dan. And here, Chua Hee Song kind of gets worse as a character because Chua Hee Song tells Kim Dan that, hey, I think Joo Jae Kyung has feelings for you. Chua Hee Song, you're not supposed to do that. This is going to push Kim Dan over the edge given how naive and delusional he already is. And Chua Hee Song is just like, hey, Kim Dan, if you are thinking about Joo Jae Kyung during our shopping trips or during our coffee dates, then I think you like Joo Jae Kyung too. Choi Song, why are you trying to make this poor boy's life worse? Kim Dan kind of believes him. So he's just like, oh, you're right. Thank you so much for all you've done to me. I need to go back to Joo Jae Kyung. Oh no, and only hell awaits Kim Dan after this point. Now we get into the good parts of Jinx, okay? Now Kim Dan's character kind of starts to make a lot of sense because even though Kim Dan is very delusional, very naive, very innocent, he actually is a decently strong character because there are times he stands his ground. But remember, he is going up against the most abusive and the strongest man in the world. So obviously, even when he clearly says no, Jo Jae Kyung can actually slap him and then is just like, okay, let's get it over with. You don't have a choice. And Jo Jae Kyung does not give Kim Dan the freedom to do anything. And yet, Kim Dan is just like, no, Jo Jae Kyung is the one for me. What sort of twisted Stockholm syndrome is this? But it's okay. I will allow it because it gets better for him. Because the last straw for Kim Dan to leave Joo Jae Kyung comes at the last episode where Kim Dan is just like checking Joo Jae Kyung's medications, and then he is just like, okay, everything is okay, and then he kind of sprays the pain medication on Joo Jae Kyung, and little does he know that Joo Jae Kyung's childhood rival or whatever replaced the painkiller spray with an ulcerative. So obviously he gets ulcers, and Joo Jae Kyung cannot leap or fight as well in the competition, so it ends in a tie. And he is just like, Kim Dan, what did you do? You did this on purpose. And he does not trust Kim Dan anymore. So Kim Dan is just like, okay, listen, this is clearly my fault. I should have checked the medications better and everything. So I don't deserve to be under you. And plus, my grandmom told me that she wants to see the ocean with me at her native. And so I need to be with her. And I am leaving you. And I hope you find someone better than me. And Kim Dan walks away. The best part in the manhwa, because it kind of gives you a very satisfying conclusion. Albeit Kim Dan kind of leaves for slightly wrong reasons, but it's fine, guys. It's all right that Kim Dan gets away from Joo Jae Kyung, okay? And even in the second season, when Joo Jae Kyung kind of finds Kim Dan, and it's just like, Kim Dan, I really need you. Kim Dan is just like, no, you gave me a lifetime's worth of trauma. I am never ever going back to you. And I am like, that's it, Kim Dan, good job. And it gets even better because Kim Dan is just like, okay, I know you need to get back into your game, Joo Jae Kyung, and I need to be the satisfaction for your Jinx. So if you just want to have an intercourse with me, fine, let's have an intercourse, but let's not look at each other's faces while doing it. It's going to be empty and null and void. And Jo Jae Kyung, for the life of him, tries really hard to make Kim Dan moan, but Kim Dan is clearly not enjoying it and is clearly resisting it. And so Jo Jae Kyung is just suffering here. That is the best thing to ever happen to Jo Jae Kyung. So this is where Kim Dan's character goes strong, and I really like it. And from here, it does not get better because the story obviously needs more drama, and they need to get Kim Dan and Joo Jae Kyung together. So Kim Dan actually drinks himself to sleep every night, and Joo Jae Kyung finds that he is sleepwalking to the ocean. So Kim Dan might actually drown at this rate. So Joo Jae Kyung is just like, no, I am here to make sure you don't accidentally kill yourself. So that's why he has to take care of him. Now, the thing is, Jinx has other side characters who provide a refreshing distraction. Like we have our Chua Hee-sung here, and we have another athlete from Joo Jae Kyung's gym, whom everybody calls Potato because he is obviously the youngest. So the relationship between Chua Hee-sung and this other athlete is also very refreshing to see from the abusive mess that Kim Dan and Joo Jae Kyung have between them. So Choi Hee-sung is the best character in Jinx, okay? Albeit he made the story take a turn for the worse, I can forgive him for that because when Choi Hee-sung meets Kim Dan in the second season, this feels like a slice of life manhwa because you see Kim Dan, Choi Hee-sung, and the other athlete having fun together, and it is one of the rarest times where Kim Dan is genuinely happy and is kind of finding a little sense of joy in his life. So, full points to Jinx for that. Now, the most terrible parts of Jinx starts here now, okay? So, we find out the reason why Joo Jae Kyung has this Jinx, aka after 98 chapters, we are finally getting the answer to why Ju Kyung is this psychotic, abusive son of a gun. Okay. And the answer is very disappointing because turns out, according to Ju Kyung's mentor, who is also Kim Dan's patient at his grandmom's hospital, Ju Kyung was abused by his dad. Like his dad used to beat him and berate him, and his mom walks out on him after Ju Kyung witnesses his dad's death. And so Ju Kyung just gets into a depression spree and he is just like, listen, winning is everything for me. But guys, it does not add up. Okay, because other anime characters have faced worse stuff than Ju Kyung. Like you take Sasuke, you take Griffith, you take anybody else from Stars Align. They do not turn into abusive, toxic assholes because they were also kind of hit and beaten in their house. Okay? And if anything, this makes me hate Ju Kyung even more because Ju Kyung does not have any sort of traumatic incidents that makes him carry this trauma throughout his life and project it onto Kim Dan. Or he has no reason to be this abusive. So I don't really get why Jo Kyung has to be this abusive towards Kim Dan because his backstory sure as hell doesn't make it right, okay? And even though we can agree that, okay, Ju Kyung goes into such a spiral of depression after witnessing his dad's death and after his mom literally said that, listen, I am going to move on from you and, I have already been married to this guy for many years and I have a family and you are a grown-up man, you can take care of yourself, so please leave me alone and do not call me again. Ju Kyung still has a father figure in his life, aka the mentor, whom he kind of has a very close relationship with and whom he kind of obeys. So I don't get why Ju Kyung starts down this path of insanity. He shouldn't be the protagonist of this story. He should be the antagonist, okay? And many anime characters don't even have that sort of father figure, but still they are pretty good. So I don't get why Ju Kyung has to be this abusive asshole. At least if Ju Kyung murders Kim Dan, I would be fine with it instead of the living hell he puts Kim Dan through. Okay, and I would have even been fine with it if the story leaned more towards Kim Dan walking away from Ju Kyung and Ju Kyung pursuing Choi Hee-sung, okay? Because the dynamic between Ju Kyung and Choi Hee-sung is more interesting. It would have been an enemies to lovers plot, but we're derailing from the rant. Let's get started on this, okay? And the reason why Ju Kyung develops this Jinx is even more stupid because Ju Kyung is on this winning streak, right, when he first joins MMA, because his mentor is just like, hey, listen, you can make big money from boxing, but you can become even richer by MMA and stop wasting your life by being in depression and picking useless fights. Instead, go here. So Ju Kyung is just really good at MMA fighting. So he's just like, okay, I am in this winning streak, but one match he faces a really tough opponent and he kind of loses continuously. So he is just like, what is happening? And then he finds out the reason for this is that every night before the match, his dad appears in his dreams and berates him like, you loser, you're just like your mother, you walk away from stuff, and you will never be as good as me. Because keep in mind, guys, Ju Kyung's dad was also a boxer. Big surprise. So Ju Kyung is just like, no, this cannot be happening. And he cannot perform well in the match because of lack of sleep. Then one day, Ju Kyung gets invited to a club and he ends up having an intercourse with one of the guys in the club. So the next day he wins and he is just like, oh, okay, let's try this again. And so he kind of starts having an intercourse with somebody or the other, and this seems to be consensual. So he is just like, oh, okay, he gets back on a winning streak, and then he is just like, wow, this is going to be great. I need somebody to have an intercourse with me before the match. Then very stupid, guys. Okay, this is where Jinx just lost me, because this makes me hate Jo Jae Kyung, and this makes him very, very irredeemable, because whatever suffering he has gone through is nothing compared to Kim Dan or Sasuke or even Shiki Ichinose from Tongan Aki. So why are we saying that, oh, you cannot hate Jo Jae Kyung after this? No, Jo Jae Kyung still very much deserves to rot in hell for all the torture he has caused Kim Dan. And then the mentor is just like, listen, Jo Jae Kyung, you think that climbing to the top and being the champion again is everything in life. No, there is more to life. You know, you have to find something you need to protect and you need to cherish. So think about it long and hard. That is more important than winning. And guess what? Jo Jae Kyung thinks about Kim Dan. What a terrible story. This is where Jinx just falls apart for me. I mean, I know it was already disturbing and it was a mess in the first season, and it kind of got better, at least in the starting of the second season when Kim Dan and Jo Jae Kyung were away from each other. But then I think it's going to spiral downwards, because I don't think Jo Jae Kyung deserves a redemption arc, and even if he gets redeemed as a character, it is not going to be very convincing, because the things Jo Jae Kyung has done to Kim Dan, like slapping him around, not treating him as a person, and disrespecting him and berating him at every turn. So obviously, Jo Jae Kyung shouldn't be excused for this. And I'll admit, okay, Jo Jae Kyung is hot, but do you know who is hotter? Nanami, Gojo, entire JJK cast, or maybe even Uzui Tengen. So this excuse of, oh, Jo Jae Kyung can get away with everything because he is hot, does not work here. And another more controversial opinion is that Jinx would have been axed or even cancelled and backlashed at, and the author would have gotten death threats or even been behind bars if Kim Dan was a girl instead of a guy. So do with that what you will. And my thoughts on Jinx overall, I give it a 5 out of 10, mostly because of Choi Hee Sung and mostly because of Kim Dan trying to be strong, at least in some chapters of the story. And there are other athletes, or even the manager of the gym, or even the side characters, anybody who is not Jo Jae Kyung or the abusive loan shark, who is actually pretty sweet to Kim Dan, okay? But I start to hate Kim Dan's granny, because she pulls a total 180, because Jo Jae Kyung happens to run into her and the granny is just like, listen, Jo Jae Kyung, I think I am keeping Kim Dan from enjoying his life, and I'm the only one here to take care of Kim Dan. So please take my place, take him to Seoul, and take good care of him. Granny, why? Why do you want to make his life worse? Like, I know you don't know what Kim Dan is going through, but seriously, this is just going to cause more suffering, because there is no way out for Kim Dan given his nature, okay? I don't even think calling the cops against Jo Jae Kyung would help, because Jo Jae Kyung is like infinitely more rich and powerful, so he can buy evidence and stuff. So, sorry to say this, Granny, you are making your grandson's life even worse, even after you go. Okay. And with that out of the way, Jinx gets a 4.5 out of 10, at least in the second season. And if it continues, and maybe if I find it worse, then the ratings will go even lower. Now, some of you who are the fans of the manhwa would argue that, hey, there are times where Jo Jae Kyung actually asked for Kim Dan's consent, or there are times when Kim Dan actually enjoyed it. Yeah, those do not count, because Kim Dan was under the influence of an aphrodisiac totally by accident, and Jo Jae-kyung was under the influence of alcohol, so he was high as hell, and then he just asked for Kim Dan's consent, and Kim Dan, being an idiot he is, just kind of agrees to it because he is just like, okay, this is a lovemaking, this is not unconsensual intercourse. Then I know that everybody has different ways to deal with their trauma, okay? But Jo Jae-kyung turning into this derogatory guy is not an answer to domestic violence. And guys, Jinx, do I recommend it to you? No. Absolutely no. You guys should never ever read Jinx. Stay away from this manhwa. Like, keep a million centimeters distance between you and this manhwa at the very least, okay? But if you guys want to do a detailed character analysis on red flags, then Jo Jae-kyung is the right person for you. But if you guys want to do a detailed analysis on toxic relationships or the repercussions on being in a toxic abusive relationship, then just read the first 10 chapters of Jinx. Other than that, please stay away from this manhwa. This is not for you. And with that, if you have made it till here, I cannot thank you enough. It is a miracle. Kamsahamnida, saranye. I'll see you in the next video.